Right, the December Q&A. Not too many questions this time since there's been a bit of a shorter gap after the last Q&A, which was delayed in November. I'm also taking the Christmas period off, more or less, so there could be a 2-week gap in between this video and the next one. As ever, the patrons get the priority on the questions, and I've taken a few from YouTube comments. But before starting, I feel myself compelled to return to the matter of headgear. Now, I had thought I was done with the matter of cavalry headgear after the last video, but a recent release over on a certain firearms channel has put out some false information I feel obliged to fix. Now, I mentioned it briefly in the Irish Army weapons video, but this is the Irish Glengarry, not a TAM. It may technically be actually more of a carbine, but we call it a Glengarry, so a Glengarry it is. In the Irish military, it is worn only by cavalrymen and reserve officers. And the difference between the two is that reserve officers have a green band and ribbons, whilst cavalry ones are black. Now, I've had it explained to me that the black is a sign of mourning, given that Michael Collins, the head of the Irish Army at the time, was killed whilst under a cavalry escort. Now, I'm not actually sure how true that connection is. It could just be a legend or a coincidence, but it's a reasonable enough argument to me. Regular Army, aka Permanent Defence Forces, have a red square backing to the cap badge. Reservists, like I was, do not. So, to correctly shape your Glen, Ian, note that the left side is indented inwards behind the cap badge, and the right side is brought down in a manner similar to a beret. So it's worn kind of like this. The first thing you need to do to your Glen is iron it. And that kind of beats the US Army beret, which you had to bloody shave before you wore it. No, it's sort of idiot, do you have to shave a beret before you wear it? Anyway, a crease down the top line, and it also forces the front and back into points. And this makes the thing much easier to put into your cargo pocket when you're not wearing it. You cheat on the right side. Once it's down and ironed in that place, you then put a couple of stitches in it to keep it in place. And there you go, a shaped Irish cavalry Glengarry. Don't worry, Ian, it's all in good fun, you weren't to know, although whoever it was that sent it to you should probably provided instructions. So on to the normal run of business. Ezio 896, how efficient was the M8 Scott? I always see it in video games, but I don't hear much about it. Okay, he's referring to the 75mm howitzer motor carriage M8, also known as General Scott. They made about 1,800 of them. The idea of mounting the 75mm pack howitzer onto an armoured vehicle dates at least as far back as the early 1930s. After all, it's a small, light gun with a reasonable high explosive charge and not too much recoil. Initial attempts weren't fantastic, with the artillery branch saying that the 75mm in the M3 light tank hull was just too crowded, although perhaps there was some merit to the vehicle as an assault gun. Eventually, the idea was put forward to place this same pack howitzer into a half-track, making the T30 as an interim vehicle whilst they try to work on something better, a bit like the M3 gun motor carriage. In the early 1940s, when armoured forces being stood up in the new battalions, initially there was going to be the split between the light battalions and the medium battalions. The role of the assault gun for the medium battalion would go to the 105mm armed M4 Sherman, once that got itself sorted out. Obviously though, the point of the light tank battalions is that they're lighter and the 105mm M4 isn't going to do the job. It also made general sense to just use the same light tanks as the light tank battalions were using anyway. Ergo, the idea of using the Stuart design. At this point, they started moving to the M5 twin Cadillacs and lower powertrain. But still, in order to give even more adequate working room, they needed to enlarge the turret ring, and the overhang at the front further meant that the hatches in the hull roof for the hull crew were not feasible, and they needed an alternative design in the front. One of the unique features of the design is the flash hider. It's the large shroud around the short gun. This all gave a vehicle with enough room to work in and the mobility to keep up with the other vehicles in the unit. Plus, it had a turret and was a little bit more flexible than a half-track T30, being easier to establish in the indirect role and faster to react in the assault gun role. By all accounts, the vehicle worked fine. It was just overtaken by events. The idea of the light tank battalion did not survive until the fielding of the M8. They realized it was a stupid idea. And the M8's role as either an assault gun in the medium tank battalions, which resulted, or as a self-propelled gun in artillery units, only lasted for as long as it took for something better to come along, i.e. the 105mm M4 assault gun and the 105mm M7 self-propelled howitzer. The vehicles were then sent off to cavalry units, which appreciated a small, fast little vehicle with a bigger gun than the 37 than their tanks and armoured cars were equipped with at the time. And of course this only lasted until the M24 Chaffee came along with its own 75. Perhaps the most important use of the M8's development though was on the M tanks. You take the M8 turret, and its relatively lightweight, allowed for it to be mounted on an LVT, providing much better immediate amphibious fire support than the 37mm Stuart turret mounted on the first versions provided. They were direct fire weapons during the initial assault, providing tank-like firepower until proper armoured and mobile tanks could be landed, at which point they would then revert back to an indirect artillery role. So overall, I'd say it was a success, even if only when viewed from a certain lens. Chase Walls. What's my opinion on the T14 Armata against other MBTs? Any thoughts or information about the M1A3 being developed to counter it? Armata does seem to be a rather popular topic of discussion and debate. Well, firstly, I strongly doubt that the M1A3 is being developed to counter specifically the T14. The design requirements are generally going to be something generic, like to defeat all armoured and unarmoured threats. The bottom line is, whatever they want the M1 to do, they want that tank to hit first, hit accurately, and hit hard. The specific design of the vehicle on the receiving end is fairly irrelevant. As for T14 itself, it's a technique. One plus side about Armata is it's a family of vehicles, which makes economic sense. How good is it? I have absolutely no idea. I've not as much as seen one, let alone crawled over it. And anybody who's professing a particularly strong opinion without having spent much time on the vehicle, which is basically everybody who professes a particularly strong opinion on it, is talking out of their arse. I have reservations as to the concept of crew and hull. I mean, I understand the benefits in terms of survivability and efficient use of space in a turret, but I am not yet convinced the Mark I eyeball from the turret roof has as yet been made totally redundant. Now, this may just be me being a reactionary dinosaur stuck in my ways. And given that the Russians apparently tend to like to fight from hatches closed anyway, the liability or inability to use the Mark I may be less critical for them. Again, I emphasize that in general, tank designers are not stupid. They have a set of requirements which need not match what anyone else's requirements are, and Armata presumably meets these requirements. Further, as modern tank commanders end up spending more and more of their time focused on the electronics, either commander's independent thermal viewer, remote weapon stations, battlefield communication systems, and so on, there is a point to be made that inevitably they're spending less and less time sticking their heads out the top anyway. So if you really want to get that unpixelated 3D binocular view of what's over the ridgeline, or to see whether or not that terrain really will support the tank or whatever, maybe the T14 commander can just stand up out of his hatch, climb to the turret roof. Realistically, how often do we really need to do that? In the US service, perhaps MGS vehicle commanders would be the closest equivalent to ask for an opinion, but they do have the advantage of already sitting atop a huge hull, so they're already pretty high up when they just open the hatch and stick their head out. Thus, it is entirely possible that the crew and hull design really is better overall for today's generation of tanks. Now, bear in mind, even if you were to put a traditional tanker and put them into our T14 for a month, long enough to actually understand its benefits, I suspect that one would still primarily get a list of opinions of negatives. Doing this is harder. That is more difficult. Backup procedures are tougher. But some of the benefits of the design may only become apparent after live combat. A top attack round, for example, impacting on a typical tank, has an excellent chance of penetrating some part of the tank which is inhabited by crewmen. Now, depending on T14's compartmentalization, and I know I would have designed some compartmentalization into the tank, that chance is dramatically reduced for T14. And because the turret is unmanned and smaller, they can put more thickness of roof and frontal armor into it for the same weight. Now again, a crewman isn't going to notice this in training when he gives his, I think the following opinion. The bottom line then is that T14 likely isn't any more lethal or dangerous than, say, the next generation of T90 would be. It may in fact be marginally less dangerous. On the other hand, it is likely to be a little bit tougher to kill, and it definitely seems to be more survivable for the crew. So if those are important criteria for you, then T14's design has merit. Spencer Loper. Do I think that mechs and other giant stompy things are viable? Mechanically, are they viable? I don't see why not. I mean, it's an engineering challenge. I'm sure eventually somebody's going to get there. And I do mean better than the ones which have already been built. The mech supposedly has one great advantage. It is not as constricted by terrain as a normal terrestrial vehicle, wheeled or tracked. They'll climb up cliffs, pick their way through rocky terrain, and so on and so forth. The primary problem, though, is ground pressure. An Orion-class heavy mech comes in at somewhere over 70 tons, the same as an Abrams. An Atlas comes in at a solid 100, so that's 35 to 50 tons per foot when standing still, and the full 75 to 100 tons per foot when walking. I'm sure someone somewhere has done ground pressure calculations. Now, presumably, eventually the foot will go down deep enough that it will meet sufficient pressure to hold it up. It's not going to end up sinking down to the Earth's core, after all. Now, this may only be a foot down. It could be 3 to 5 feet down. I don't know. It very well may be sufficiently deep that it impedes the movement of the other foot, and so the mech gets stuck. The other problem is that as armored vehicles go, mechs are stupidly inefficient designs. The amount of protection that a tank needs for its powertrain in the back here is pretty small. The whole thing is compact and fits in an area maybe 3 meters by 3 by 1.5. Whereas if you can imagine the weight and volume of all the various actuators, hydraulics, pumps, and everything else that a stompy thing needs in order to move its various limbs and torso about, the figures are going to be daft. Your next problem is frontal target size. A tank designer tries to make the frontal aspect of a tank as small as possible. And it's easier to make this armor thicker at the front when you do so. Most of the surface area of a tank is not visible to the enemy, and so it needs not be as thickly armored. Whereas a mech has the entire front of the torso to armor up. More inefficiency. Now, perhaps a partial counter to this is to fall the vehicle forward onto its belly and effectively start high crawling. Enter the multi-legged mechs, like Xanthos or Great Turtle. They are more stable, have less ground pressure, and a smaller frontal profile requiring less armor. Of course, now you have twice the amount of hydraulics to run, if not more if you go for an arachnid design. So no, for heavy combat vehicles, and cool though AT-ATs are, I don't see giant stompy things ever being practical enough to replace tracked vehicles. Small stompy things, like before mentioned power suits, however, do seem far more reasonable if we ever get the power supply problems sorted out. Robert Henry Ilston, what would I store inside my tank versus outside? Well, almost everything not required for the inside of the tank was stored outside. So there are stowage points inside the tank for everything from maps and spare bulbs to gas masks. And there isn't much room for anything else. I personally brought my laptop inside and stuffed it in the corner right rear of the TC slot, but that was it. Everything else went in the bustle rack or the side sponson. I can't speak to what other folks did. Now, it should also be added that I am spoiled by American levels of external stowage. Everything we would need for, let's say, a month redeployment to Mosul, we carried on the tank. Bustle rack, extended bustle rack on the blowout panels in the side sponsons, lots and lots of room. I have no idea how British or German tank crews managed to do it with their small little covered bins. They look neat, but lack capacity to my mind. Andrew, going back to UK tanks in World War II, they eventually came up with Cromwell, Comet and Centurion. Was this an effect of an improved process, more practice by the tank designers, or just a fluke? given that in the same timescales you also get things like black prints. Now, I suspect that the genesis of this question is last month's one where I referenced G. MacLeod Ross's litany of issues. It wasn't just the tank designs getting practice, as I understand it. The Ministry of Supply and the Army also starting getting its act together as well. So the tank designers are getting more practice at designing things, and the Ministry is getting more practice at specifications and ordering. However, Andrew was talking basically about 3 different project lines, as it were. 2 of them are evolutionary. The Vauxhall line, which is Churchill and then expanded into black prints, literally expanded. Think Churchill expanded in all directions except for armor thickness and power output. And the other was the Cromwell Comet line, which is obviously of the lineage of the earlier cruisers. Centurion, though, was a blank slate. With enough American vehicles coming over to fill the shortfall, and with Cromwell and Comet keeping the factories busy with a reasonable enough vehicle for now, the British designers could completely start afresh. If Centurion didn't work out, it wasn't going to be the end of the world, unlike the situation, say, when they were designing Crusader, when the British needed something good enough right the hell now. More likely though, since the British were no longer under the same level of time crunch, they could afford to slow down and do the job right, which they did. Commissar Carl wishes to know about other countries' tank uniforms. Now, I've done a tank uniform video, and I'm going to have to pass on that one for now simply because I don't know enough to answer intelligently. I suspect, however, that I'll be able to put up answers in the future, so I'll bear it in mind. TN Sheep, complete this sentence. All I want for Christmas is blank. Shades of Les Dawson or Terry Wogan there. All I want for Christmas is blank. World peace. However, since that seems a little bit unreasonable, I'll go with an M3 scout car. Since that also seems unlikely, as does that Maserati the wife wants, good luck with that. I'm kind of hoping for a larger fish tank. Wife keeps saying that she's going to refinish the cabinet, the things that it's going to go on top of, but that doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon. Otherwise, all things considered, life's pretty good. Keep throwing video opportunities and ideas my way, keep growing my channel and adding Patreons. Admiral Tiberius, would I ever see the 120 or 125mm caliber for the main gun be replaced by something larger or smaller as technology changes? I think bigger seems more likely than smaller. I can really only recall one move to smaller, and that was the Israeli 60mm hypervelocity cannon, which he ended up mounting mainly on Shermans. The first problem with that, though, is that it's all but a pure anti-armor round, much less bang of HE. The other problem is, given that the round is faster but lighter, it loses speed faster, which means reduced effectiveness at range. As optics, fire control systems and the likes get better, longer and longer engagement ranges, up to eventually line of sight, will not become unlikely. It is observed that 120mm is about the limit as to what a human loader can handle, at least for one piece of ammo. But as human loaders become less and less used in forthcoming tank designs, this limitation seems to be less of a problem. So then it comes down to more ammunition capacity and the question of just how big a gun with how much recoil are you going to have to try to stuff into a tank to get tank effects? So bear in mind that the Soviets did muck around for a good bit with a long 152mm main gun, but then they went back down to the 125. As granted did the Americans in the MBT-70, although I'm not sure that was quite the same level of pressure and velocity. Charles Charange wants to know my opinion on flamethrower tanks. They certainly seem to do the job back in the day, as recently as Vietnam. They are certainly a damn sight safer than trying to run up to a bunker with a backpack, either a satchel charge or a handheld flamethrower. On the other hand, they aren't as safe as a good thermobaric or modern fused conventional round, so like the backpack flamethrower, their day has passed. I do not recall actually ever having come across any crew experiences with the vehicles. I've only ever come across accounts from folks outside the vehicles, either watching or on the receiving end. And the commentary from both sides is usually on the gist of a significant emotional event, which probably explains why they were around so much. Joe Polloway, Will I ever do a high-speed tour of the Canadian War Museum? Next time I'm in Ottawa, yes. I've been there a few times. For those who don't know, the Canadian War Museum is a relatively modern facility in downtown Ottawa. Good indoor parking, if you happen to find yourself there in winter for some reason. And for those of us who are interested in tanks, Vimy Hall has about 30 armoured vehicles, including a few of the more rare ones, such as the Jagdpanzer 470. Definitely worth a visit if you're in town. I reserve this question about science fiction tanks for a future time. RAW, what is the best tank coax machine gun ever designed? That's an interesting one. One will be doing very well to beat the FN Mag, and there's a reason it shows up everywhere. It's reliable, it's light, it's effective, it's simple, barrel changes are a piece of cake. Then again, I have no experience with the DTs, the PKTs, or the MG3. I have no particular reason to doubt their capability either. And technically, the M2 caliber 50 is a coaxial machine gun as well, although perhaps one with a slightly different concept of use in mind. I won't say that machine gun evolution has reached the pinnacle, but it does seem that we're about reaching the apex of MG design, no matter what country or mechanical operating principle you want to look at. So I don't really have an answer. I will say by reputation that it doesn't seem to be the M73. Kazuki K. Do tank ventilation systems work when the engine is off? Answer, yes. They're all electric, and like all electrical systems in the tank, can work off the battery. Now, the original question, which I didn't put down, actually had a presupposition in it. And it gave the example of power traverse requiring that the engine be operating. And although that was the case for some vehicles, it's actually not the case for most tanks. Those with electric traverse obviously can simply draw straight from the power supply, but normally hydraulic traverse tanks can have auxiliary pumps run on the battery power as well. That said, the speed of traverse from a battery versus when the engine is running is not necessarily the same. An M1's turret traverse rate is about a quarter, if not less, under backup power than full power. But it sure as hell beats hand cranking. There was also a question about whether there was any successful application of wet lubricated track. I guess the Germans thought it was successful since they kept with it all the way through the war on their lighter vehicles. Doesn't make any sense to me, but they seem to have liked it. And I can't think of any other applications off the top of my head, so I'm going to figure it didn't make much sense to anybody else either. That said, the existence of the quite famous Canadian dry pin tracks for Shermans seems to imply that there was a Canadian wet pin track. But danged if I can tell you what that may have been, though I haven't found anything on it. Baz Slats wants to know, with the predominance of thermal imagers and the like, why do folks bother turning their tanks into moving trees? Okay, for anybody who's been in the US Army in the last 20 years, hot flash, most countries don't care so much about forestry protection rules as we do, and it is actually possible to take local foliage and place it on your tank to conceal it from vision. Well, Bass is partially right. There has, oddly enough, been plenty of effort put forward into concealing the thermal signature of a vehicle. So in the meantime, why bother doing that and then leaving the vehicle open to everybody else with a pair of binoculars? Methods of reducing the thermal signature include active measures, thermal blankets or camo netting, a second skin which works a bit like a vacuum flask, or Velcro paneling, amongst other things. And face it, even today, there are more eyeballs looking around without thermal imagers than there are with. So the bottom line is, at worst, it doesn't hurt. Except the trees, who some believe can feel pain. Stafford, I'm going to come back to yours in another video. Admiral Tiberius is wondering about canister ammo. And it certainly dates back a very long ways, basically to the days of grape shot. Imagine, if you will, a 120mm shotgun, and well, that's modern canister. In World War II, it was found mainly in the American 37mm gun. Quite useful in the jungles of the Pacific in particular, although I do seem to recall that the Aussies made one for the 2-pounder. The 75mm also had one, the T30 canister shot, which contained 270 lead balls. So Shermans and Grants could use that in the jungles quite well as well. The Australians highly valued canister shot in Vietnam from the 20-pounder guns. Not necessarily so much for their lethal effect, but because they had a fantastic ability to strip away foliage and camouflage, making enemy positions highly visible. Today, the US Army has reintroduced canister to the Abrams, the M1028 round, which contains approximately 1150 tungsten balls. The tough, dense metal is used that has a secondary use as a breaching round. If you have barbed wire to the front, for example, the canister round will make a nice gap for the infantry. The same can be said for house walls, if you don't mind going through a few walls before the balls stop. And these walls may also include rebar. So if you want to punch a hole for the infantry to go through, tungsten could help you. The related but somewhat different round is beehive. There are two main differences between beehive and canister. The first is that beehive usually comes with flechettes as opposed to balls. The difference is likely academic to infantry on the receiving end. The other difference is the fuse. Canister has no fuse. Once it reaches the muzzle, the shot pattern on canister starts to spread. Beehive, however, generally remains intact until it reaches a set distance, at which point the fuse detonates and the components start separating. This gives beehive a longer effective range. I do seem to recall a round similar to beehive which uses tungsten rods instead of flechettes, which may be an alternative to MPAT in the anti-aircraft role, a modern round, but for the life of me I can't seem to find the name of it offhand. Canister is due to be replaced in service in the US by the new AMP round, which is a HE round with a multi-setting programmable fuse, although I find myself a bit suspicious they can really be replaced. So that's about it then. I hope you had a good Christmas, and may the new year bring you all sorts of fortune. Oh, and if you see me in Charleston this weekend, say hi.